My son and his wife went on a luxury cruise, leaving me to babysit my 10-year-old grandson, Leo. 3 years ago, Leo was diagnosed with selective mutism. He had not spoken a single word, not a whisper since he was 7. But the moment the heavy oak front door shut behind his parents, Leo looked up at me. His eyes were completely clear, and in a perfect, unwavering voice he said, "Grandpa, do not drink the tea Mom made." She plotted. My blood ran completely cold. If you are just tuning in, please take a deep breath. My name is Victor Caldwell. I am 70 years old, a retired structural engineer, and I live in a quiet, secluded waterfront estate in the suburbs of Seattle, Washington. Before I continue this story, please hit the like button to show some support for a grandfather who had to fight for his life. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what happens next. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. It truly warms my heart to know you are listening to me today. The heavy thud of the front door closing was still hanging in the air. Outside, the low hum of the Uber carrying my son Preston and his wife Monica down the long gravel driveway toward the Seattle cruise port slowly faded into the distance. Inside the grand foyer of my home, the silence became absolutely deafening. I stood frozen, paralyzed by a physical and psychological shock that hit me harder than a freight train. I looked down at Leo. My 10-year-old grandson stood perfectly still, clutching the straps of his small backpack. For 3 long years, I had watched this boy communicate only through nods, subtle gestures, and written notes. We had taken him to specialists, therapists, and doctors across the state, all of whom told us his vocal cords were fine, but his mind had locked his voice away due to some unknown trauma. Now he had just spoken a complete, flawless sentence. I dropped to my knees, my old joints popping in protest, and gripped his small shoulders. I asked him, my voice shaking, to repeat what he had just said. Leo did not hesitate. He did not stutter. He looked me dead in the eye and repeated the warning. "Grandpa, do not drink the tea Mom made," she plotted. A sharp ringing started in my ears. The sheer miracle of hearing my grandson speak was instantly swallowed by the terrifying gravity of his words. I slowly stood up and turned my gaze toward the kitchen island. There, sitting on the polished granite countertop, was a steaming porcelain mug of chamomile tea. My mind began to race, pulling up memories from the past few hours, the past few days, stitching them together into a horrifying tapestry. Monica, my 36-year-old daughter-in-law, was the quintessential picture of a perfect mother. She was active in the local parent-teacher association, always dressed immaculately, always wearing a bright, practiced smile. Just 20 minutes ago, she had practically forced me to sit down while she bustled around my kitchen. She told me she had bought a special organic herbal blend to help soothe my arthritis pain while they were away at sea. She had been so attentive, so caring. It had warmed my old heart to see her looking after me. But as I stared at the faint wisp of steam rising from the mug, a dark, unsettling realization began to settle in my stomach. I spent 40 years of my life as a structural engineer. I designed bridges and commercial high-rises in downtown Seattle. My entire career was built on calculating stress, identifying structural weaknesses, and understanding exactly where a foundation was likely to crack. Now I was looking at the foundation of my own family, and I could clearly see the deep, jagged fractures spreading across the concrete. My thoughts drifted to Preston, my 38-year-old son. He was a hedge fund manager, a man who loved the appearance of wealth. He wore tailored suits, drove imported cars, and always spoke about his investments with arrogant confidence. I had paid for his college education. I had provided the safety net that allowed him to take risks in the financial sector. I gave him everything, assuming my unconditional support would be returned with respect. But over the past few weeks, Preston had been acting strangely. He was irritable, constantly checking his phone, jumping at sudden noises. And then there was last Tuesday. Last Tuesday, Preston had walked into my private study with a thick folder of legal documents. He slid them across my oak desk with a heavy sigh. It was a medical power of attorney. He had placed a hand on my shoulder, looking at me with eyes full of fabricated pity. He told me that my memory was slipping. He claimed I had been repeating myself, forgetting conversations we had supposedly just had, and misplacing important documents. He said it gently, framing it as a loving son trying to protect his aging father. I had believed him. I am 70 years old. It is easy to convince an old man that his mind is finally starting to show the wear and tear of a long, exhausting life. I had signed the papers trusting my flesh and blood to make medical decisions for me if I ever became incapable. I did not realize I was being conditioned. I did not realize I was being meticulously set up for a fall. I walked slowly into the kitchen, the hardwood floor creaking softly beneath my shoes. I stood over the porcelain mug. The sweet floral aroma of chamomile drifted up, masking whatever nightmare Monica had stirred into the hot water. An ordinary man, acting purely on emotion and betrayal, might have swept the mug off the counter, letting it shatter into 100 pieces on the floor. He might have screamed in anger, but I am not an ordinary man. I am a man of science, of logic, and of evidence. I knew that if I simply threw the tea away, I would have no proof. A drugged cup of tea could easily be explained away by Monica as a simple mistake, a mix-up of her own prescription medications. I needed something undeniable. I opened the kitchen drawer and pushed past the silverware until my fingers brushed against a small, empty plastic bottle of eye drops I had discarded earlier that week. I took it to the sink, popped the top off, and rinsed it thoroughly with scalding hot water. Drying it quickly, I walked back to the tea. With a steady hand, completely devoid of the tremor that usually plagued me, I siphoned a generous amount of the warm liquid into the tiny plastic vial. I snapped the cap back on tightly and slipped the bottle deep into the front pocket of my trousers. I would test it later. I had a heavy-duty chemical testing kit in the garage for the estate swimming pool, and I knew enough about chemical reactions to find out exactly what she had given me. Then I picked up the mug. I walked over to the dining room where a massive potted ficus plant stood bathed in the afternoon sunlight. I poured almost all of the remaining tea deep into the potting soil, making sure the dark earth absorbed every drop. I left just a tiny splash of liquid at the bottom of the mug, enough to make it look convincingly finished, and set it back on the kitchen island. I turned back to Leo. He was watching me with an intensity that broke my heart. A 10-year-old boy should not have the eyes of a war veteran. He should not have to carry the burden of saving his grandfather from his own parents. I walked over to him, knelt down again, and pulled him into a tight embrace. I told him he was safe. I promised him that no one was going to hurt him, and no one was going to hurt me. I could feel his small heartbeat racing against my chest. Right at that moment, the sharp ring of my cell phone pierced the quiet house. I pulled it from my pocket. The caller ID flashed on the screen. It was Monica. She was calling me on FaceTime from the Uber barely 30 minutes after leaving the house. The trap was set, and the game had officially begun. The phone vibrated in my palm. The sudden buzzing echoed sharply against the silent walls of the grand foyer. I glanced down at the bright screen. It was a FaceTime request. Monica's name flashed in bold letters, accompanied by a picture of her and Preston smiling on some sandy beach from a vacation I had paid for last summer. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my racing heart to steady. I had spent 40 years negotiating with difficult contractors, managing high-stress environments, and hiding my anxiety behind a mask of professional calm. I needed every ounce of that discipline right now. I swiped the green button to accept the call and held the phone up to my face. Monica filled the screen. She was sitting in the back of the luxury vehicle they had hired for the ride to the port. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, not a single strand out of place. She wore that immaculate, practiced smile she always used at school fundraisers and charity galas. It was a smile that reached her cheeks but completely bypassed her cold, calculating eyes. "Hi, Victor," she chirped. Her voice was dripping with an exaggerated sugary sweetness that made my stomach churn. "We are just getting on the highway now. I wanted to check in on you and Leo before we lose a good cell signal." I shifted the phone slightly to catch a glimpse of the background. Preston was sitting beside her, his broad shoulders pressed against the leather seat. He was staring stubbornly out the tinted window, watching the Seattle skyline blur past. He did not look at the camera once. He did not acknowledge his father. He just sat there, a cowardly accomplice hiding behind his wife's terrifying charade, unable to look his victim in the eye. "I am doing just fine, Monica," I replied deliberately, letting my voice drag just a fraction of a second slower than usual. "Leo is upstairs in his room. I was just about to sit down." Monica leaned closer to the camera. The subtle shift in her posture was predatory. "Did you drink the tea I made for you?" she asked. Her tone was casual light, as if she were merely inquiring about the weather. But her eyes were intensely focused, searching my face for the slightest symptom. "I put a special blend of herbs in it. It is supposed to do wonders for joint pain and tension. Are you feeling sleepy yet?" The sheer audacity of her question sent a jolt of pure anger through my veins. She was casually probing to see if her poison had taken hold. I needed to feed her exactly what she wanted to hear. "I drank it right after you closed the door." I lied, letting my eyelids droop slightly. I raised my free hand and rubbed my temples, mimicking a man trying to fight off a sudden heavy wave of exhaustion. "It was very good, Monica. Thank you. Actually, I am feeling a bit strange. Very lethargic. My head is a little cloudy." I watched the screen closely. The transformation in her expression was instantaneous, though microscopic to anyone who was not looking for it. The corners of her mouth twitched upward. A dark, triumphant gleam flashed in her eyes. It was the look of a hunter watching the poison finally bring down a massive, stubborn beast. She had won, or so she believed. "Oh, that is just the herbs doing their job, Victor," she said smoothly, her voice taking on a soothing, almost hypnotic rhythm. "You've been working so hard in the garden lately. Your body just needs to rest. Why do you not go lie down on the couch? Just take a deep sleep. Leo knows how to keep himself entertained. Just close your eyes and rest." "Maybe I will do just that," I mumbled, letting my words slur together slightly. "Have a safe trip, you two." "We will," she said, her smile widening into something genuinely sinister. "Sweet dreams, Victor." The screen went black. The call disconnected. I lowered the phone, my hands gripping the device so tightly my knuckles turned white. The performance was over. The sickening reality of what had just transpired settled heavily over me. My own daughter-in-law had just gleefully watched me pretend to succumb to whatever cocktail of drugs she had laced my drink with, while my own son looked the other way. I turned away from the foyer and walked briskly down the hallway toward the door leading to the attached garage. The grandfatherly fatigue I had just faked vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating surge of adrenaline. I pushed open the heavy fire door and stepped into the cool, dimly lit expanse of the garage. My workspace was meticulously organized. Tools lined the walls in perfect alignment. On the far side of the room, sitting on a steel workbench, was my heavy-duty chemical testing kit. I maintained a large indoor heated swimming pool on the property, which required precise chemical balancing. Over the years, I had learned exactly how different reactive agents interacted with organic and synthetic compounds. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the tiny plastic eye drop vial containing the sample of Monica's tea. I set it carefully on the metal bench under the bright fluorescent worklight. My hands moved swiftly, pulling out glass test tubes, droppers, and a series of reagent bottles used for detecting heavy metals, pH imbalances, and complex alkaloids. I squeezed a few drops of the tea into a clear glass tube. It looked innocent enough, just a pale, golden brown liquid. I selected a reagent designed to test for high levels of synthetic depressants and added 3 drops into the tube. I capped it, gave it a firm shake, and held it up to the light. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a slow, violent reaction began to occur. The pale liquid started to cloud over. Within seconds, it shifted from golden brown to a deep, dark, bruised purple. The color was so intense, so unnatural, it practically glowed under the fluorescent bulb. I stared at the purple liquid, my breath catching in my throat. I did not need a laboratory degree to understand what I was looking at. The chemical reaction indicated a massive, overwhelming concentration of synthetic central nervous system depressants. This was not a mild sleep aid. This was not an accidental double dose of a basic prescription. This was a heavy, calculated cocktail of sedatives mixed with what appeared to act like a powerful hallucinogen. It was a chemical straitjacket. If I had consumed that entire mug, I would not have simply fallen asleep. The specific combination of these drugs would have paralyzed my motor functions while throwing my mind into a state of severe waking delirium. I would have lost the ability to form coherent words. I would have lost my sense of balance, my spatial awareness, and my grip on reality. To an untrained observer or a paramedic arriving at the scene, I would not look like a man who had been poisoned. I would look exactly like a 70-year-old man suffering from a sudden massive stroke or experiencing a rapid, violent onset of advanced dementia. They were not trying to kill me with the tea. They were trying to erase my mind. They wanted to strip away my autonomy, my credibility, and my ability to defend myself. They wanted to reduce me to a babbling, confused burden completely at their mercy. And Preston, my own flesh and blood, had handed me the legal authority to let them do it just last week. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I placed the test tube back into the rack, my mind working furiously. The meticulous nature of this plan was terrifying. It required forethought access to heavy restricted narcotics and a complete sociopathic disregard for human life. But as I stood there in the quiet garage staring at the violent purple evidence of their betrayal, a new, even more disturbing thought began to claw its way into my mind. Why today? Why give me the drugs, right as they were leaving for a cruise where they would be completely out of contact, if their goal was to declare me incompetent and take control of my assets using the medical power of attorney? It made no logical sense to do it when they were miles out at sea, unable to manage the medical fallout, unless the drugs were not the final step in their plan. Unless the tea was only the catalyst for something much worse. Something that required them to have an airtight, undeniable alibi. I turned away from the workbench and looked back toward the door leading into the house. Leo was inside. My silent, traumatized grandson, who had somehow known exactly what his mother was plotting. I had to go back to him. I had to find out exactly what else he knew because I was suddenly very certain that the purple liquid in that test tube was only the beginning of a much darker nightmare. I locked the garage door and headed back inside, the true weight of my family's betrayal pressing down on me with suffocating force. I knew I had to act fast. My survival and Leo's survival depended on it completely. I hurried back into the main living room, my heavy footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug. Leo was exactly where I had left him. He sat rigidly on the edge of the leather sofa, his small hands gripping his backpack tightly. His dark eyes darted toward me wide with a mixture of profound fear and desperate anticipation. I knelt in front of him, ignoring the sharp shooting pain in my old knees. I placed my hands gently on his forearms, grounding him, trying to convey a sense of absolute safety. I looked directly into his eyes and asked him the question that was burning in my chest. I asked him how he knew about the tea. I asked him how he knew his mother had plotted against me. Leo did not speak this time. Instead, his lower lip began to tremble, and a single tear traced a path down his pale cheek. Slowly, his trembling fingers reached for his left wrist. He was wearing a dark gray digital smartwatch. It was a simple device, the kind parents buy for their children to track their location and send brief text messages. Preston had given it to him for his 9th birthday. With meticulous, practiced movements, Leo unbuckled the strap and placed the watch into the palm of my hand. He tapped the small glass screen a few times, swiping past the colorful clock face and the simple game applications. He opened a hidden directory buried deep within the system settings. The screen illuminated a massive list of audio files. There were dozens of them meticulously categorized by date and time stretching back for over a year. I stared at the tiny glowing screen, a profound, devastating realization washing over me. For 3 years we had taken this boy to every specialist in the state of Washington. We had subjected him to endless psychological evaluations, speech therapy sessions, and neurological tests. Every single doctor had given us the exact same diagnosis. They told us he suffered from selective mutism triggered by an unspecified emotional trauma. We thought his mind was broken. We thought he was trapped in a silent prison he could not escape. But as I looked at the vast library of secret recordings, the heartbreaking truth finally snapped into focus. My grandson was not broken. He was a survivor. His silence was not a medical condition. It was a calculated trauma-induced survival mechanism. In a house filled with deceit, manipulation, and monsters disguised as parents, Leo had realized that the safest way to survive was to become entirely invisible. He had stopped speaking so they would forget he was in the room. He had become a ghost in his own home, silently listening, silently observing, and silently gathering the evidence he knew he would need one day. I swallowed hard and pressed the most recent audio file. The tiny speaker on the watch crackled to life. The audio was slightly muffled, likely recorded from behind a closed door, but the voices were clear. It was Preston. My son was pacing. His voice was frantic, vibrating with a raw panic I had never heard before. He was screaming that all the money was gone. He ranted about a massive investment in a cryptocurrency market that had completely collapsed overnight. But he had not just lost his own money. He had borrowed heavily to cover his losses. He screamed that he was $4 million in debt. He was not in debt to a bank or a legitimate financial institution. He owed the money to an underground loan shark operating out of the commercial shipping ports in downtown Seattle. Preston sounded like a cornered animal. He was sobbing, begging for a way out, terrified for his life. Then another voice cut through the recording. It was Monica. Her tone was not panicked. It was not sympathetic. It was terrifyingly calm, as cold and sharp as a surgical scalpel. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with the chilling, calculated precision of a predator sizing up its prey. She told Preston to pull himself together. She reminded him that the loan sharks did not care about apologies or delays. They would break his legs, and then they would come for her. She told him there was only one exit strategy left. She told him that his father, me, was the only viable source of liquid capital large enough to save them. Preston protested weakly, arguing that my assets were locked in trusts and that I would never simply hand over $4 million to cover a gambling debt. Monica laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound that made my skin crawl. She told him he lacked vision. She explained that they did not need me to agree to anything. They just needed me out of the way. She outlined the entire plan with sickening clarity. She said they needed to make me legally incompetent. She mentioned the medical power of attorney they had tricked me into signing. She said all they needed was a medical emergency, a severe cognitive episode that would allow Preston to seize immediate, uncontested control of my estate. Then her voice dropped an octave, dripping with pure, unadulterated malice. She said that making me look crazy might take too long. She suggested it would be much faster, much cleaner, if the old man simply had a fatal accident. She specifically mentioned my car. She said it would be so tragic if I suffered a sudden episode of dementia, panicked in the middle of the night, and crashed my heavy vehicle. I pressed the button on the side of the watch, cutting off the audio. The silence rushed back into the room, but it brought no comfort. I looked down at the hardwood floor, my aging chest heaving as I desperately struggled to process the sheer, terrifying magnitude of their pure evil. The boy sitting in front of me had listened to his own parents orchestrate the murder of his grandfather. He had carried the weight of this terrifying secret in absolute silence, waiting for the exact right moment to warn me. In that precise moment, something fundamental inside me fractured and reformed into something completely new. The gentle, forgiving grandfather who had spent his life trying to provide for his family died on that living room floor. In his place, a ruthless, calculating protector awakened. My only son had willingly chosen to become a monster, and I would treat him exactly like one. I glanced at the antique grandfather clock standing in the corner of the room. Its brass pendulum swung back and forth with a steady, rhythmic ticking. Preston and Monica were currently in a luxury vehicle speeding toward the cruise terminal. Within a few hours, they would be boarding a massive ocean liner sailing away from the Seattle coastline and entering international waters. They established the perfect alibi. They believed they left a helpless old man alone. They truly thought they won. But they made a massive miscalculation. They underestimated the silent boy and the man who built their world. The clock was ticking, and I knew exactly what I had to do next. I could not simply pick up the phone and dial 911. The police would arrive, and I would hand them a plastic vial of purple liquid. But without context, without undeniable proof of a malicious motive, what did I really have? A clever defense attorney would tear my accusations apart in seconds. They would claim Monica simply made a terrible mistake. They would argue she accidentally mixed her own heavy sleep aids into my tea instead of the herbal supplements. They would paint me as a confused, paranoid old man who was overreacting to an innocent, albeit dangerous domestic error. Preston had already laid the groundwork for that exact narrative when he forced me to sign that medical power of attorney. He had already established a documented history of my supposed mental decline. If I acted too soon, if I moved without absolute concrete evidence of their financial desperation and premeditated intent, I would be handing them the exact weapon they needed to lock me away in a psychiatric facility. I needed a paper trail. I needed the undeniable proof of a motive that no lawyer could wave away. I left the hallway and walked deliberately toward the west wing of the estate. Preston had converted the large, sunlit library into his private home office. He always kept the heavy mahogany door locked when he was not inside. It was a fortress of his own, making a place where he conducted his supposed high-level financial trades. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my master ring of keys. I still owned the master set from when the contractors finished the remodel 3 years ago. I slid the brass key into the lock, turned it with a sharp click, and pushed the door open. The office was a shrine to his enormous ego. A massive glass desk dominated the center of the room. The walls were lined with expensive leather-bound books he had never read, and framed accolades he had likely purchased. I walked straight to the glass desk and pulled at the drawers. They were securely locked. I could have spent an hour trying to pry them open, but I knew I did not need to. I knew Preston. He was a man who loved the illusion of security, but he was inherently lazy. He would not keep his most dangerous secrets in a desk where a determined burglar or a curious cleaning lady might look. He would keep them hidden within the very bones of the house. And I knew the bones of this house better than anyone. I was the structural engineer who had completely redesigned this estate. I had paid for the renovations, drafted the blueprints, and personally overseen the framing of every single wall. I knew the dimensions of every room down to the quarter inch. I stepped back and slowly scanned the room. My eyes traced the custom wooden wainscoting that wrapped around the lower half of the walls. I remembered a specific architectural discrepancy. On the far wall just behind a large leather reading chair, there was a void. During the framing process, the contractors had to box around a structural support column, leaving a dead space roughly 2 feet wide and 3 feet deep. Preston had insisted on keeping the wainscoting flush across that entire section for aesthetic reasons. It was the perfect invisible hollow. I walked over to the leather chair and shoved it out of the way. I knelt on the thick carpet and ran my fingertips along the top edge of the wooden wainscoting. My fingers traced the decorative molding until I felt a nearly imperceptible seam. It was a custom magnetic latch system. I pressed my palms flat against the wood, pushed firmly upward, and then pulled back. The entire wooden panel popped loose with a soft click. I set the heavy panel gently on the floor and shined a small pocket flashlight into the dark void between the wooden studs. There it was. Bolted directly into the structural crossbeams was a heavy-duty digital wall safe. It was a high-end model constructed of solid steel featuring a biometric scanner and a 12-digit electronic keypad. Most people would have taken one look at that fortified steel box and given up. But Preston was predictably arrogant. He believed he was the smartest man in any room. He trusted technology implicitly, but he rarely possessed the patience to read a user manual. When I installed a similar safe in my previous home years ago, I learned that these specific models shipped from the manufacturer with a universal 6-digit factory override code. It was designed for technicians to bypass the lock if the electronic motherboard failed during installation. Homeowners were supposed to manually reprogram or completely disable this override code the moment they set their personal passwords. But doing so required navigating a tedious 30-minute sequence of complicated inputs. I was willing to bet everything I had that my son, in his endless rush to feel important, had simply ignored that crucial step. I crouched in front of the steel door. My hands were remarkably steady as I reached out and punched in the universal factory sequence. 6, 8, 2, 4, 9, 0. I pressed the pound key. A long, agonizing second passed. The keypad beeped once. A green light flashed brightly in the darkness of the wall cavity. The heavy internal locking bolts retracted with a loud mechanical clank. I pulled the steel handle, and the heavy door swung open smoothly on its hinges. The inside of the safe was packed. There were stacks of cash, a velvet box containing Monica's expensive jewelry, and several thick manila folders. I ignored the cash and the jewelry. I grabbed the folders, pulled them out into the light of the office, and spread them across the glass desk. I opened the first folder. It contained months of physical printed bank statements for Preston's highly touted hedge fund. He had always bragged about his exclusive client list and his brilliant market strategies. He claimed he was managing over $50 million in assets. I began to scan the columns of numbers, my engineering mind effortlessly translating the complex data. Within 3 minutes, the horrifying reality of his financial empire became painfully clear. There was no hedge fund. There were no brilliant market strategies. The entire operation was a massive, carefully constructed Ponzi scheme. The statements showed a desperate, chaotic flow of capital. He was taking deposits from new investors and using that exact same money to pay fabricated, artificially inflated returns to his older clients. There was no actual revenue being generated. There were no legitimate corporate investments. The money was simply being shuffled around in a frantic, doomed circle to maintain the illusion of overwhelming success. And the circle had finally collapsed. I pulled up the most recent summary from just 2 weeks ago. The fund was completely drained. The account balances were hovering in the negative. He had burned through millions of dollars of other people's money. The sheer volume of the fraud was staggering. He was not just broke. He was entirely bankrupt, and he was staring down the barrel of decades in a federal prison the moment his wealthy investors realized their money had vanished into thin air. I looked at the next folder. It contained copies of desperate high-interest loan agreements. The documents corroborated exactly what I had heard on Leo's hidden audio recording. Preston had borrowed $4 million from an unregulated underground lending syndicate in a frantic last-ditch effort to inject cash back into his failing scheme. He had gambled with money he did not have borrowed from people who did not forgive debts. The interest rates were astronomical, bordering on extortion. The repayment deadlines had already passed. My son was a fraud. His entire life, his tailored suits, his luxury vehicles, and his beautiful home were all built on a mountain of lies and stolen money. He had backed himself into a corner so dark and so dangerous that he had decided the only way to survive was to sacrifice his own father. He needed my assets to pay off the loan sharks and flee the country before the federal authorities raided his non-existent firm. I stood alone in his quiet office, surrounded by the undeniable proof of his absolute moral and financial bankruptcy. The cold, hard truth settled over me like a suffocating blanket. Preston was not just a desperate man making a terrible mistake. He was a calculated predator willing to destroy his family to save himself. I reached for the third and final folder resting at the bottom of the stack, completely unaware that the darkest piece of their murderous puzzle was still waiting to be uncovered. The third folder was unusually thick, bound with a tight elastic cord that snapped sharply against the quiet of the room as I pulled it free. It bore the embossed logo of a prominent national insurance conglomerate. My hands, which had remained perfectly steady while cracking the safe, now developed a faint involuntary tremor. I laid the heavy stock paper flat on the glass desk and began to read through the dense legal jargon. It was a comprehensive life insurance policy taken out on me. The ink on the final signature page was fresh, dated barely 6 months ago. I scanned the coverage details, my eyes jumping over the premium schedules to land directly on the payout clause. $5 million. That was the exact price tag my son had placed on my remaining years. And listed boldly underneath the payout amount in a clear digital print was the name of the sole beneficiary. Preston Caldwell. There were no provisions for Leo. There were no trusts established for his care, no educational funds set aside, and no secondary beneficiaries listed. The money was routed directly to a private offshore holding account that Preston controlled exclusively. The sheer, unabashed greed of it made my stomach turn. He had calculated my net worth, added a $5 million death benefit, and decided that my demise was the only mathematical solution to his massive self-inflicted debt. It was a cold, clinical execution of a father by a son who viewed human life as nothing more than a ledger of assets and liabilities. I pushed the heavy document aside, feeling a deep, suffocating sorrow. But as I moved the paper a second much thinner, envelope slipped out from the back of the folder. It lacked the thick, impressive binding of the first policy. It was a single page, a supplementary rider finalized just 2 weeks prior. The timing aligned perfectly with the moment Preston had shoved the medical power of attorney into my hands. I pulled the crisp white sheet from the envelope, expecting to find a secondary policy on Monica, or perhaps a property insurance claim for this very house. Instead, the name printed under the primary insured section made the breath completely vanish from my lungs. It was Leo, my 10-year-old grandson, the boy who had spent 3 years trapped in a prison of silence, terrified of the monsters raising him. I stared at his full legal name printed in stark black ink. I blinked hard, praying that my aging eyes were deceiving me, but the letters remained unchanged. It was a newly minted life insurance policy, specifically categorized under a comprehensive accidental death rider. The payout in the event of a fatal unforeseen tragedy was a staggering $2 million. A wave of nausea washed over me so violently, I had to grip the edge of the glass desk to keep my knees from buckling. The air in the room suddenly felt thin, cold, and utterly devoid of oxygen. A father conspiring to steal from his elderly parent is a tragedy as old as time itself. It is a painful, bitter betrayal, but it is a familiar sin. But parents plotting to monetize the slaughter of their own disabled child is a level of pure, unadulterated evil that defies human comprehension. I traced my trembling finger over the specific stipulations of the rider. The policy would only pay out double the base amount if the death was ruled a strict accident, such as a severe automotive collision, a drowning, or a fatal fall. It explicitly voided the payout in the case of a prolonged illness or natural causes. They had insured him against a violent end. The horrific puzzle suddenly snapped together in my mind with terrifying crystalline clarity. Every strange interaction, every misplaced document, and every sugary smile Monica had given me over the past month aligned into a singular, murderous trajectory. The purple liquid sitting in the test tube in my garage was not meant to simply make me look like a confused old man. If their only goal was to declare me legally incompetent, they would have slowly administered smaller doses over a period of several months, building a credible medical history to present to a judge. But they did not have months. Preston owed $4 million to violent loan sharks who were likely threatening his life right now. He needed a massive immediate injection of cash. He needed $7 million. They needed me incapacitated, but perfectly awake. The sedatives and hallucinogens were meticulously calculated to strip away my rational thought while keeping my motor functions barely intact. They needed a tragedy that would trigger both payouts simultaneously. The twisted brilliance of their plan made my blood run ice cold. They were going to use my drug-induced delirium as the weapon. I envisioned the sequence of events they had planned for this very night. A heavily drugged grandfather wakes up in a state of severe chemical panic. Paranoia sets in. He becomes convinced that someone is breaking into the house or that a fire is spreading through the halls. Acting on a desperate, impaired instinct to protect his grandson, he forces the boy out of bed. He herds him into the heavy sport utility vehicle parked in the garage. He throws the car into reverse and speeds out into the dark, winding roads of the Seattle suburbs, driving erratically toward the steep, treacherous cliffs overlooking Lake Washington. But a panicked driver is not enough to guarantee a fatal outcome. Modern vehicles have advanced safety features. They needed to ensure the crash was catastrophic and completely unsurvivable. They needed to ensure the brakes failed exactly when the vehicle gathered enough momentum on a steep decline. I stood up, leaving the horrifying documents scattered across the glass desk. The pieces of the plot were fully illuminated now. Preston and Monica were currently sipping champagne on a luxury cruise liner, deliberately positioning themselves miles out in the ocean. They were establishing an ironclad, indisputable alibi. When the police eventually pulled our crushed vehicle from the freezing waters of the lake, the grieving parents would be safely surrounded by hundreds of witnesses at sea. They would return to shore to play the devastated victims of an accident caused by an elderly man whose mind had sadly deteriorated. They would bury us, collect $7 million, pay their debts, and walk away clean. The profound sorrow I felt just moments ago completely evaporated, incinerated by a white-hot, protective rage. They had targeted my grandson. They had looked at a beautiful, traumatized boy and seen nothing but a $2 million paycheck. I turned my back on the home office and sprinted down the hallway. I did not care about the pain in my joints or the heaviness in my chest. I had to reach the garage. I had to inspect my vehicle. The final piece of evidence was waiting beneath the chassis of my car, and I needed to find it before the real nightmare began. I burst out of the home office, leaving the heavy mahogany door wide open behind me. The thick carpet absorbed the frantic thud of my shoes as I sprinted down the long, shadowed hallway of the West Wing. For a man of 70 years, moving at such a reckless pace should have sent shooting pains through my arthritic knees and caused my lungs to burn. But in that moment, I felt absolutely no physical pain. The sheer, unadulterated terror pulsing through my veins acted as a powerful anesthetic. My mind was completely consumed by a singular, desperate objective. I had to get to the garage. I had to inspect my vehicle. The final piece of this murderous puzzle was waiting beneath the chassis of my heavy sport utility vehicle, and I needed to expose it before their twisted trap could spring shut. I reached the heavy fire door that separated the main house from the garage. My hands were shaking so violently that I fumbled with the polished brass knob before finally wrenching it open. I stepped out into the cavernous, dimly lit space. The air inside the garage was significantly cooler than the rest of the house, carrying the familiar metallic scent of motor oil and cold concrete. The space was large enough to comfortably hold 4 vehicles, but right now it housed only my dark gray SUV. It sat dead center on the spotless epoxy floor, looking like a silent, waiting beast. It was a top-of-the-line model chosen specifically for its reinforced steel frame and advanced safety ratings. I had bought it just last year to ensure Leo would always be as safe as possible whenever I drove him to his medical appointments or therapy sessions. The irony of that purchase now tasted like ash in my mouth. I walked briskly to my tool station, mounted along the far wall. I grabbed a high-powered LED flashlight and pulled my wooden mechanic's creeper out from under the workbench. My engineering background had taught me never to assume the structural integrity of anything until I had visually and physically inspected every single load-bearing component. I dropped the creeper onto the cold concrete floor right next to the driver's side front wheel of the SUV. I lay down on the padded board, clicked the heavy flashlight on, and pushed myself underneath the massive steel undercarriage of the vehicle. The space beneath the SUV was tight and claustrophobic. The bright white beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the complex, heavy machinery that powered the 2-ton vehicle. I moved the light methodically, scanning the thick steel axles, the heavy-duty suspension coils, and the dense network of wiring harnesses. Everything looked perfectly normal at first glance. There were no obvious signs of tampering. There were no loose bolts, no dangling wires, and no pools of leaking fluids pooling on the concrete floor. But Preston and Monica were not careless amateurs. They were calculated predators who needed their sabotage to look exactly like an unpredictable mechanical failure. If they had simply severed a vital component, I would have noticed the malfunction the moment I started the engine and tried to back out of the driveway. I would have simply called a tow truck, and their entire murderous plot would have been instantly foiled. No, they needed the vehicle to operate perfectly fine at low speeds. They needed it to fail only when I was traveling at a high velocity, driving down a steep incline where a sudden loss of control would guarantee a catastrophic fatal impact. I directed the beam of the flashlight toward the master brake cylinder and began to trace the primary hydraulic lines that fed the braking system. I followed the thin, rigid metal tubes as they routed along the frame of the vehicle, running from the master cylinder all the way down to the individual brake calipers on each wheel. I scrutinized every inch of the metal tubing, looking for any sign of stress or tampering. I rolled myself further back on the creeper, pulling myself under the rear axle. I pointed the light directly at the flex hoses. These were the flexible, rubberized lines that connected the rigid metal brake pipes to the moving calipers on the wheels. They were the most vulnerable point in the entire hydraulic system. My breath hitched sharply in my throat. The beam of my flashlight froze. There it was. The thick, protective rubber casing on the rear left flex hose had been meticulously sliced open. I reached up with a trembling hand and gently ran my index finger along the damaged section. The cut was incredibly precise. Whoever had done this had not used a clumsy knife or a dull saw. They had used a specialized wire cutter to score the heavy rubber and bite deeply into the braided steel mesh that reinforced the hose. They had not severed the line completely. They had merely compromised its structural integrity, weakening the hose just enough so that it could no longer withstand high hydraulic pressure. I quickly rolled over and inspected the right rear flex hose. It bore the exact same meticulous, calculated scoring. The sabotage was brilliant in its absolute cruelty. If I were just driving around the quiet, flat suburban streets of our neighborhood at 20 miles per hour, the weakened hoses would likely hold. The brakes would respond normally to light pressure. But if I were driving down a steep, winding incline, if I suddenly panicked and slammed my foot down hard on the brake pedal, the sudden massive spike in hydraulic fluid pressure would instantly blow the scored lines wide open. The brake fluid would violently spray out into the air. The brake pedal would snap uselessly to the floorboard, and the heavy vehicle would become an uncontrollable 2-ton missile. I lowered the flashlight, resting it on my chest, as I stared blankly at the dark undercarriage of the vehicle. The entire horrifying scope of their murder plot crystallized in my mind with terrifying precision. Every isolated piece of their plan suddenly locked together to form a flawless, inescapable death trap. The first step was the poisoned tea. Monica had laced the chamomile with heavy sedatives and synthetic hallucinogens. The drugs were carefully chosen to induce a state of extreme paranoia, severe motor impairment, and intense psychological panic. They knew my medical history. They knew I suffered from mild nighttime anxiety. The chemical cocktail would take effect slowly, waiting until the dead of night to fully overwhelm my nervous system. I envisioned exactly how they expected this night to play out. I would wake up in my bedroom entirely consumed by a drug-induced terror. My mind would be fractured, projecting horrific threats into the shadows of the empty house. I would become desperately convinced that Leo was in imminent mortal danger. Operating on raw, impaired instinct, I would stumble into his room, pull my mute, terrified grandson from his bed, and drag him down to the garage. I would force him into the passenger seat of this very vehicle, believing I was saving his life. I would start the engine and tear out of the driveway, fleeing from imaginary demons. I would speed down the dark, winding residential roads, heading blindly toward the treacherous, steep cliffs that overlooked the deep, freezing waters of Lake Washington. The road leading down to the water was notoriously dangerous, filled with sharp switchbacks and sudden plunging drops. As I descended the steep grade, my drug-addled mind would perceive a threat. I would slam my foot onto the brake pedal to slow the heavy speeding vehicle. In that exact fraction of a second, the massive hydraulic pressure would hit those meticulously scored flex hoses. The braided steel mesh would violently rupture. The brake fluid would blow out. The vehicle would lunge forward completely devoid of any stopping power. We would smash through the flimsy metal guardrail at 50 miles per hour and plummet into the pitch-black depths of the lake. The aftermath would be a masterpiece of tragic deception. The police would eventually pull our crushed, waterlogged vehicle from the wreckage. They would test the brake lines and find the ruptures, attributing the catastrophic failure to wear and tear or debris from the road. The medical examiner would run a toxicology screen on my body and discover the massive cocktail of sedatives. Preston would then step forward, acting the part of the devastated, grieving son. He would hand the investigators the medical power of attorney document, tearfully explaining that his poor elderly father had been suffering from rapid, severe cognitive decline. He would tell them I must have accidentally overdosed on my medications in a fit of dementia, panicked in the middle of the night, and tragically killed myself and his beloved son in a terrible accident. The authorities would close the case within a week. There would be no criminal investigation. There would be no suspicion of foul play. The insurance conglomerates would review the official police report and immediately authorize the payouts. $2 million for Leo's accidental death rider. $5 million for my life insurance policy. $7 million in clean, untraceable cash deposited directly into Preston's offshore accounts. It was the perfect crime. And the most sickening part of the entire scheme was their alibi. By booking a luxury cruise that departed Seattle this very afternoon, they had ensured they were hundreds of miles out in the Pacific Ocean, safely surrounded by thousands of witnesses and completely out of cellular range when the accident occurred. They would return to port in 5 days, step off the ship, and graciously accept the condolences of a mourning city. I lay on the hard wooden creeper, my breathing shallow and fast. The sheer calculated evil of my own son and his wife was so profound, it physically sickened me. I had dedicated my entire life to providing for Preston. I had worked 80-hour weeks to ensure he never knew the sting of poverty. I had bought him this beautiful house. I had handed him every advantage in the world. And in return, he had calmly and methodically engineered a plot to murder his own child and his own father, simply to cover a gambling debt to a syndicate of ruthless loan sharks. A violent, protective fury finally burned away the last lingering remnants of my grandfatherly sorrow. I was no longer a victim. I was an engineer, and I was going to systematically dismantle their entire lives. But as I grabbed the edges of the creeper board to pull myself out from beneath the dark chassis of the vehicle, the sudden brilliant flash of the exterior motion sensor lights flooded the garage windows. The sudden illumination cast long, sharp shadows across the concrete floor. I froze completely still. I held my breath, listening intently over the faint ringing in my ears. Through the thin walls of the garage, I heard the distinct heavy crunch of thick rubber boots stepping slowly and deliberately onto the gravel driveway outside. They were not alone. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Preston and Monica had not left the execution of this perfect crime entirely to chance. They knew the drugs might not work exactly as planned. They knew I might just fall asleep instead of panicking. They had hired someone to stay behind. They had hired a cleaner to break into the house, trigger the panic, and ensure the accident happened exactly as scheduled while they were safely out at sea. The final phase of their murder plot had just arrived at my front door. I remained perfectly still beneath the massive steel undercarriage of the sport utility vehicle. The cold concrete floor pressed rigidly against my spine through the thin wooden board of the mechanic's creeper. The sudden brilliant glare of the exterior security lights bled through the high frosted glass panels of the garage door, casting long and distorted shadows across the ceiling. I held my breath, letting the absolute silence of the enclosed space amplify every external sound. Through the insulated walls, the distinct and heavy crunch of thick rubber soles pressing into the loose gravel of the driveway echoed with terrifying clarity. The footsteps were slow, methodical, and profoundly deliberate. This was not a lost delivery driver or a confused neighbor. This was a predator arriving to finish a job. My mind, already running on pure adrenaline, rapidly calculated this new and terrifying variable. Preston and Monica had sailed away on their luxury cruise, securing their perfect alibi, but they were far too cowardly and far too controlling to leave the actual execution of their plot entirely to chance. They knew my habits. They knew there was a slight possibility that their chemical cocktail might only put me into a deep sleep rather than inducing the frantic waking delirium they required for the staged car crash. They needed a failsafe. They needed someone to physically break into the estate, drag my drugged body and my terrified grandson into this sabotaged vehicle, and send us plummeting off the cliffs overlooking the dark lake. They had hired a cleaner, someone professional, someone ruthless, and someone who expected to find an incapacitated old man and a helpless child. The heavy footsteps paused near the side entrance of the garage. I could hear the faint metallic rustling of someone inspecting the heavy-duty lock. I knew I had only a margin of seconds before this intruder decided to bypass the lock or move toward the main glass doors of the foyer. I reached up and carefully switched off the small pocket flashlight, plunging my tight enclosure back into total darkness. My 70-year-old joints screamed in protest as I gripped the edges of the wooden creeper board. I engaged my core, ignoring the sharp, stabbing pain radiating through my lower back, and slowly pulled myself out from beneath the chassis of the heavy vehicle. Every inch of movement felt agonizingly loud. The tiny plastic wheels of the creeper rolled against the epoxy floor with a soft grinding sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I slid out past the front bumper and smoothly rose to my feet, relying on decades of muscle memory to keep my balance steady in the dark. I moved with a desperate, silent urgency toward the side access door leading to the gravel pathway. The brass deadbolt was already engaged, but I knew the standard latch was vulnerable to a skilled intruder. I reached out with trembling fingers and quietly slid the heavy secondary steel security bar into its reinforced bracket. The thick metal cylinder slid into place with a faint, reassuring click. Just as the steel bar seated itself, the brass doorknob on the other side twisted violently. The heavy wooden door shuddered against the frame as a massive weight was thrown against it. The intruder had tried to force his way inside, assuming the simple lock would give way. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The thick steel security bar held firm, but I knew it was only a temporary barrier. The man outside was testing the perimeter, searching for the path of least resistance. He would soon realize the garage was secured from the inside and move toward the large glass windows of the main house. I could not stay in the garage, and I absolutely could not leave Leo alone in the living room for another second. I turned away from the exterior door and moved swiftly toward the heavy fire door that connected the garage to the interior hallway of the estate. I pulled the heavy handle, slipped through the opening, and gently eased the door shut behind me, making sure the heavy latch clicked silently into its housing. I engaged the internal deadbolt, sealing the house off from the garage. The air inside the hallway felt thick and suffocating, charged with the sudden reality of an active home invasion. I moved down the carpeted hallway with the silent, practiced grace of a man who had built every inch of these floors. The grand foyer was bathed in the pale silver glow of the moonlight, filtering through the high arched windows. I stayed close to the walls, avoiding the open spaces where my silhouette might be visible from the outside. The ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the distant living room served as a metronome for my racing pulse. I reached the wide archway of the main living space and scanned the room. Leo was still sitting rigidly on the edge of the leather sofa. The dim light of his digital smartwatch illuminated his pale, terrified face. He looked up as I entered the room, his dark eyes wide and searching. I raised my index finger to my lips, issuing a frantic, silent command for absolute quiet. I crossed the large room in 3 long strides and dropped to my knees directly in front of him. I reached out and gently gripped his small, trembling shoulders. I did not need to speak a single word. Leo possessed a profound, intuitive understanding of fear. He had survived his entire life by reading the subtle shifts in the emotional atmosphere of this house. He looked at my face, saw the stark, unfiltered terror in my eyes, and instantly understood that the nightmare his parents had orchestrated was no longer just a distant plan recorded on a hidden audio file. The monster was outside, and it was actively hunting us right now. I pointed toward the heavy floor-to-ceiling curtains that covered the massive bay windows overlooking the front driveway. I gestured for him to slide off the leather sofa and join me on the floor. Leo moved with the fluid, silent grace of a ghost. He slipped his backpack over his shoulders, slid down onto the thick Persian rug, and pressed himself flat against the baseboard. I crawled next to him, positioning my larger body between his fragile frame and the expansive glass windows. We sat in the suffocating darkness, listening intently to the sounds of the house. The heavy, deliberate crunching of gravel had moved away from the garage and was now circling toward the front porch. The motion sensor lights in the front yard blazed to life, casting a harsh, blinding white light across the manicured lawn. Through a tiny gap in the heavy curtains, I could see the massive, distorted shadow of a man stretching across the front steps. The shadow was broad and imposing, moving with a calm, extremely cold, and terrifying confidence. The intruder did not rush. He stepped onto the wide concrete porch, his boots echoing. I closed my eyes, preparing to fight for my grandson's precious life. The heavy boots stopped right outside the massive oak front doors. The frosted glass panels framing the entryway captured the outline of a motionless figure. He was listening, waiting to see if anyone inside would react to the sudden glare of the security lights. I held my breath, pressing my hand against Leo's chest to feel his racing heartbeat. We remained completely still against the living room baseboard. After a terrifying minute, the shadow shifted. The footsteps moved off the porch, crunching slowly toward the back of the estate. He was looking for an easier entry point. This was my only window of opportunity. I leaned close to Leo's ear. I whispered for him to follow me, to step exactly where I stepped, and to make absolutely no sound. We crawled out of the living room, navigating the dark hallway until we reached the basement stairs. The thick carpeting muffled our descent. I kept one hand firmly gripping Leo's shoulder, guiding him down into the pitch-black lower level. I led my grandson directly past the recreational areas and toward the iron door of the massive wine cellar. I pushed the iron door open. The ambient temperature dropped. Racks of vintage wines lined the brick walls, casting long shadows in the dim emergency lighting. I walked to the back of the cellar, stopping in front of a mahogany wine rack that appeared permanently bolted to the masonry. I had spent my life designing structural safe havens for wealthy clients, and I refused to live in an isolated mansion without a secure fallback point. I reached behind a row of dusty bottles and pressed my thumb against a hidden biometric scanner embedded in the wood. A soft chime echoed. The entire mahogany rack unlatched with a heavy pneumatic hiss. I pulled it outward, revealing a solid steel-reinforced door set directly into the poured concrete foundation of the house. This was the panic room. It was built to withstand a Category 5 hurricane, a severe seismic event, or a violent home invasion. I slowly spun the combination dial, grabbed the heavy steel handle, and pulled the vault door open. The interior was stark but functional. I ushered Leo inside. He looked around the windowless space, his dark eyes wide with apprehension. I moved quickly, pulling a case of bottled water and several protein bars from the emergency shelves. I set them on the small folding table in the corner. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my digital tablet, handing it to him along with a pair of noise-canceling headphones. I knelt down in front of him, taking his cold, trembling hands in mine. I looked deep into his eyes, projecting every ounce of certainty and strength I possessed. I told him he was safe here. I promised him that no matter what he heard, no matter what loud noises or terrible crashes echoed from the floors above this steel door, would never open from the outside. I told him he was the bravest boy I knew. I promised him that I would handle the monsters and that when this door finally opened again, it would only be me. He did not speak, but he nodded slowly, his small jaw set with profound resolve. I stood up, stepped out of the concrete room, and pulled the heavy steel door shut. The massive internal deadbolts engaged with a loud clank. Leo was secure. Now that my grandson was out of harm's way, I needed to level the playing field. Monica had insisted on installing a wireless security camera system throughout the interior of the entire estate. Right now, she was likely sitting in a stateroom on a cruise ship, frantically trying to connect to the network to watch her hired killer execute his task. I could not allow her to have eyes inside my house. I could not let her warn the intruder of my movements. I left the wine cellar and walked briskly to the utility closet located at the far end of the basement corridor. I opened the metal utility panel that housed the central network hub and the main routers. I bypassed the complex software interfaces and simply gripped the thick bundle of yellow Ethernet cables connecting the wireless routers to the main modem. I ripped them out of their sockets. The green data lights on the modem instantly flashed red before dying out completely. The house was now entirely offline. Monica was blind, and her hired cleaner was flying blind inside a house I knew better than he ever could. I turned away from the utility panel and moved toward my final destination. Tucked discreetly behind the main staircase was a tall, heavy gun safe. I quickly punched in the numeric code and swung the door open. Inside rested a custom 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. I pulled the heavy weapon from its rack, the cool steel of the barrel grounding me. I grabbed a handful of heavy buckshot shells and methodically loaded them into the tubular magazine. Each shell slid into place with a satisfying metallic snap. I racked the slide, chambering the first round. The loud, intimidating sound echoed sharply against the basement walls. I was armed. I was prepared to defend my home and my family with lethal force. But as I stood there in the darkness, holding the heavy weapon, my analytical mind took over. If I walked upstairs and shot the intruder the moment he broke through the glass, the immediate threat would be neutralized. The police would arrive, view the shattered window, see the dead man on my floor, and rule it an open and shut case of self-defense against an armed burglar. But Preston and Monica would remain untouched. They would return from their cruise play, the terrified parents, and walk away free. They would hire a better lawyer, challenge the power of attorney again, and find another way to eliminate me and take their son's life insurance payout. A dead burglar could not testify against them. A dead burglar could not confess to the orchestrated murder plot. If I wanted to save Leo permanently, if I wanted to ensure my son and his monstrous wife spent the rest of their miserable lives rotting in a federal penitentiary, I could not just pull the trigger. I needed the cleaner alive. I needed him conscious, terrified, and willing to trade the names of his wealthy employers for his survival. I needed to trap him. I lowered the barrel of the shotgun, my mind mapping the floor plan of the floors above. I knew the structural weak points. I knew the blind corners. I knew how to use the layout of this massive estate to turn the hunter into the hunted. The intruder thought he was stalking a highly confused, heavily drugged, and completely defenseless old man. He was completely unaware that he had just stepped into an engineered labyrinth controlled by a very angry, heavily armed grandfather. I took a deep, steadying breath, gripped the shotgun tightly, and began my silent, calculated ascent up the basement stairs. The trap was set. It was finally time to invite the monster inside. I stood at the top of the basement stairs, the heavy shotgun resting against my shoulder. The darkness of my home had transformed from a comforting blanket into a tactical advantage. The intruder had circled the perimeter, testing the heavy oak of the front entrance and the reinforced steel of the garage. I knew exactly where he would go next. The back patio. It was the architectural Achilles heel of the estate, a design concession Monica had vehemently demanded during the remodel. She had insisted on expansive dual-pane French doors to showcase her rose garden. Those doors were aesthetically beautiful, but practically vulnerable, framed in decorative wood rather than solid steel. They offered a breathtaking view, but to a structural engineer, they were nothing more than a glaring compromise in the physical integrity of the home. I navigated the familiar layout of the kitchen by memory alone, my feet making no sound against the polished hardwood floors. I set the shotgun down on the cold granite countertop. I needed both of my hands for the next few critical minutes. I was not a soldier, and I was not a trained fighter, but I was a structural engineer who had spent 40 years understanding the precise transfer of energy force and resistance. I knew exactly how to build, and more importantly, I knew exactly how to weaponize my own environment. I walked over to the utility drawer near the walk-in pantry and pulled out a thick, heavy-duty electrical extension cord. I grabbed a pair of industrial wire strippers and a heavy roll of conductive black tape. My mind moved with a cold, calculated efficiency, stripping away the terror of the situation and replacing it entirely with the soothing, undeniable logic of physics and raw circuitry. I moved quietly to the mudroom adjacent to the back patio doors. I knelt on the floor and stripped the thick orange insulation from the end of the heavy-duty extension cord, exposing the raw braided copper wire underneath. I needed a power source that would deliver a massive, incapacitating shock without causing lethal cardiac arrest. I reached into the locked security cabinet mounted above the utility sink and retrieved the high-voltage taser battery I kept for personal defense. It was a commercial-grade unit designed to drop a fully grown man to the ground in a fraction of a second. It generated a massive pulse of kinetic energy that would override the central nervous system instantly. I did not want to kill this man. A corpse could not give me the full recorded confession I desperately needed to put my own son behind bars for the rest of his natural life. I spliced the raw copper wires from the extension cord directly into the output terminals of the heavy battery pack, securing the connection with tight overlapping layers of electrical tape. I then carried my improvised apparatus toward the French doors. The pale moonlight spilled through the glass, illuminating the custom brass handle Monica had imported from Italy. Brass is an exceptional conductor of electricity. I wrapped the exposed copper tightly around the base of the brass handle, ensuring a continuous point of direct contact. The circuit was almost complete, but I needed to guarantee maximum conductivity the moment the violent intruder stepped inside. I walked back to the mudroom and picked up the wrought iron ventilation grating that covered the floor heating duct. I carried the metal grate to the patio entrance and laid it flat against the hardwood floor, directly beneath the brass door handle. I ran a secondary grounding wire from the taser battery and attached it securely to the iron grate. Finally, I went to the kitchen sink and filled a large plastic pitcher with cold tap water. I returned to the doors and poured the water over the thick woven welcome mat, resting just inside the threshold, ensuring the fabric was completely saturated. I pushed the soaked mat directly over the iron grating. The water pooled slightly around the edges, creating a highly conductive surface that would soak instantly through the rubber soles of his boots. The physical placement was critical. He would have to step directly onto the wet mat to gain enough leverage to pull the heavy door open. The trap was a basic, highly effective closed-circuit system. The moment the intruder stood on the wet mat and touched the electrified brass handle, his body would instantly complete the circuit. The high-voltage current would travel from the handle, tear through his nervous system, and ground out through the wet mat into the iron grate. It would lock his muscles, paralyze his motor functions, and drop him to the floor in a state of agonizing incapacitation. I connected the final wire to the battery pack and stepped back silently into the deep shadows. I picked up the 12-gauge shotgun from the granite countertop and pumped a shell into the chamber. I retreated behind the massive marble island, positioning myself in a perfect tactical blind spot. From this angle, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the patio doors, but the intruder would not be able to see me until he was fully inside the room. I settled into the darkness, regulating my breathing, forcing my heart rate to slow to a steady, rhythmic thud. The silence of the house stretched out heavy and oppressive. I listened to the faint ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the distant living room, counting the agonizing seconds. I thought about Leo safely locked away in the concrete panic room beneath the foundation. I thought about my son sailing away on the ocean, believing he had successfully orchestrated my murder and the murder of his own child. My grip on the shotgun tightened until my knuckles ached. I would not die tonight. I would not let them win. The sudden sharp crunch of rubber boots on the back patio slate broke the silence. The heavy footsteps were confident, steady, and lacking any attempt at stealth. The hired cleaner believed he was dealing with an incapacitated, heavily drugged target. He believed the house was empty and waiting for him. I watched the dark silhouette of a massive, broad-shouldered man eclipse the pale moonlight, filtering through the French doors. He stood there for a moment, peering through the dual-pane glass, trying to see into the black kitchen. He was wearing a dark, heavy jacket and a black ski mask pulled up over the lower half of his face. He raised a steel tool wrapped in a dark cloth and slammed it brutally against the glass. The sharp crash of shattering glass echoed through the entire house like a cannon shot, a violent declaration of his lethal intent. Shards of broken glass rained down onto the soaked welcome mat, glistening in the moonlight that spilled across the floor. He reached his thick-gloved hand through the jagged hole in the pane, searching for the internal deadbolt latch to unlock the door from the inside. He found the latch, twisted it open with a metallic click, and then his hand moved downward, reaching for the electrified brass handle. The heavy glove of the intruder closed firmly around the polished brass handle of the French doors. In that fraction of a second, the improvised circuit I meticulously built sprang to life. 50,000 volts of stored kinetic energy surged instantly from the battery pack, racing through the stripped wire directly into the conductive metal. Because the intruder stood squarely on the water-soaked mat, his body became the absolute path of least resistance. The electricity tore through his jacket and grounded violently through his boots into the iron grate beneath him. A sharp crackle of raw electrical current echoed through the kitchen, illuminating the room with a sudden blue flash. The massive intruder did not have the opportunity to scream. The overwhelming voltage bypassed his central nervous system entirely instantly, locking every single muscle in his body into a state of rigid, agonizing paralysis. His eyes bulged wide behind the black fabric of his ski mask, and his jaw clamped shut with a sickening snap. For 2 agonizing seconds, he stood completely frozen, violently convulsing against the shattered door, trapped in the invisible storm of electrical current. Then gravity took over. The high-voltage charge overwhelmed his synapses, and his knees buckled beneath his enormous weight. He collapsed backward, dropping to the kitchen floor like a heavy sack of bricks. His head struck the hardwood floor with a dull thud, and his massive frame twitched sporadically as the residual current dispersed into the wet mat. I did not hesitate. I stepped out from behind the safety of the marble island, keeping the barrel of the 12-gauge shotgun trained directly on his unmoving chest. My movements were sharp and completely devoid of the paralyzing fear that gripped me earlier. I walked briskly to the edge of the puddle, carefully avoiding the soaked fabric. I reached out with the wooden stock of the shotgun and knocked the wire splicing away from the battery terminal, permanently breaking the electrical circuit. With the trap disabled, I moved in. The intruder took shallow, ragged gasps of air, but he was completely unconscious. I kicked the cloth-wrapped steel tool out of his limp hand, sending it skittering across the floorboards until it slammed against the base of the cabinets. I knelt beside him and grabbed the top of his ski mask, ripping it violently off his face. He was a younger man, with a thick, brutal jawline and a jagged scar running down his neck. He looked exactly like the disposable muscle a loan shark would send to collect a debt. I reached into my pockets and pulled out 4 industrial-grade zip ties. I grabbed them from my workbench when I inspected the sabotaged vehicle. They were designed to bundle heavy steel rebar constructed of thick plastic that could not be broken. I rolled his body onto his stomach, ignoring his faint groans. I pulled his thick wrists behind his back, interlaced them, and cinched the first zip tie around his forearms as tightly as I physically could. The plastic teeth zipped loudly, biting deeply into his jacket. I used a second tie to perfectly secure the binding. I moved down to his rubber boots, crossing his ankles and binding them together with the remaining 2 ties. I pulled the straps until they dug into the leather. He was completely immobilized. I stood up and grabbed at him by the thick collar of his jacket. Utilizing the leverage of my legs, I dragged his massive bound frame away from the shattered glass and the puddle of water, pulling him into the center of the kitchen. I propped him up against the cool surface of the marble island, leaving him in a seated position. I pulled an oak bar stool over, sat down directly in front of him, and rested the shotgun across my knees. I waited in the dim moonlight, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. It took nearly 3 minutes for the high-voltage shock to fully wear off and for his brain to reboot. His thick fingers twitched, pulling futilely against the rigid plastic zip ties. A low, guttural groan escaped his lips. His heavy eyelids fluttered open, blinking rapidly as he desperately tried to orient himself in the unfamiliar room. He shifted his weight, realized his hands and feet were entirely bound, and let out a sharp gasp of panic. His head snapped up, his disoriented eyes darting around the kitchen until they locked onto me. I sat perfectly still on the bar stool. The moment our eyes met, I raised the heavy shotgun. I did not move quickly. I moved with a slow, terrifying deliberation. I pressed the cold steel barrel of the weapon directly against the center of his forehead, right between his panicked eyes. I did not yell. I did not curse or raise my voice. After 40 years of managing impossible situations, I knew that true authority did not require volume. True authority required the absolute promise of consequences. I spoke with a chilling calm, my voice dropping to a low whisper that resonated with the cold certainty of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. I told him I knew exactly who he was, and I knew exactly why he was here. I told him about the poisoned tea sitting in my sink. I told him about the scored brake lines on my vehicle. I told him about the medical power of attorney and the accidental death life insurance policies that Preston and Monica believed they were going to collect in 5 days. I watched the blood drain from his face as I dismantled the secret murder plot he thought he was executing. He realized he had walked into a meticulously prepared slaughterhouse. I pushed the cold steel barrel a fraction of an inch harder against his skull, forcing his head back against the marble island. I told him my son and daughter-in-law had sailed away on a luxury cruise, leaving him behind to do their dirty work. I explained they had set him up to take the fall if anything went wrong. I told him I disabled the internal security cameras, meaning nobody was coming to help him, and nobody was watching what I was about to do. I made it absolutely clear that his employers viewed him as nothing more than a disposable tool, and his life was resting entirely on a hair trigger. I looked into his terrified eyes and demanded the truth. I told him he had exactly one opportunity to survive this night. He needed to tell me every detail of the arrangement. He needed to give me the names of the loan sharks Preston owed money, to the exact instructions Monica had given him regarding my grandson, and the precise timeline of their intended alibi. I whispered that if he lied to me, hesitated, or tried to protect the monsters who hired him, I would not call the police. I would simply pull the trigger, wrap his body in a heavy tarp, and bury him beneath the concrete foundation of a house I built with my own hands. I told him to start talking. The man swallowed hard, his bare throat bobbing against the thick plastic collar of his jacket. The sheer proximity of the shotgun barrel, coupled with the lingering, agonizing shock of the taser, had completely stripped away his hardened exterior. He was not a mastermind. He was a blunt instrument, and he suddenly realized he had been swung against a reinforced steel wall. He began to speak, his voice trembling, rushing to spill every dark detail before my patience ran out. He confessed that he was a debt collector. He worked directly for the underground lending syndicate, operating out of the commercial shipping ports, the exact same violent men Preston owed $4 million to. He told me that the cruel woman named Monica had bypassed Preston entirely and approached his bosses 2 weeks ago. She had offered them a highly lucrative alternative repayment plan. She paid him $50,000 in cash up front, simply to ensure a tragic accident occurred tonight without any complications. His job was never to kill me directly. A direct murder, a home invasion resulting in blunt force trauma, or a gunshot wound would initiate a massive homicide investigation. Monica knew that would freeze the insurance payouts and invite federal scrutiny. Instead, his instructions were terrifyingly precise. He was supposed to break the glass trigger, the home security alarm, and make just enough noise to force my heavily drugged, paranoid mind into a state of absolute waking terror. He knew about the chemical cocktail in my tea. He was told I would be delirious, unable to process reality, but desperate to protect my grandson. His sole objective was to herd me and Leo down into the garage. He was supposed to block the front doors, forcing us into the sabotaged sport utility vehicle as our only means of escape. Once I threw the car in reverse and fled the estate in a blind panic, he was instructed to follow us in his own vehicle. He was supposed to stay close behind, tailgating aggressively, to ensure I drove fast and recklessly toward the steep, winding roads overlooking Lake Washington. He was there to guarantee the compromised brake lines snapped exactly where the drop-off was the most fatal. He was the shepherd, and we were the sheep being driven off a cliff. I listened to the clinical, detached way he detailed our intended execution. The sheer depravity of her plan was suffocating. She had calculated every psychological trigger, every mechanical failure, and every human instinct. She had weaponized my love for my grandson, intending to use my protective nature as the very instrument of his death. I kept the shotgun leveled at his chest and ordered him to empty his pockets. He squirmed against the thick zip ties, clumsily shifting his weight, until a heavy black burner phone slid out of his jacket pocket and clattered onto the hardwood floor. I kicked it toward my feet, reached down and scooped it up. I knew this phone was his direct line to Monica. I knew they needed confirmation that the job was done before they could relax into their watertight alibi. I glanced at the digital clock glowing on the face of the kitchen microwave. It was nearing 3 in the morning. Preston and Monica had departed Seattle hours ago. According to the standard itinerary for that specific luxury cruise line, the massive ship would be entering Canadian waters soon. In roughly 1 hour, they would temporarily dock at the Port of Victoria in British Columbia for customs clearance. For a brief, crucial window, they would be close enough to shore to pick up a cellular signal. They would be waiting anxiously in their extravagant stateroom, staring at their phones, desperate for the text message or the phone call that confirmed they were rich and we were dead. I reached into my own pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I opened the high-definition audio recording application and set the device on the marble island, pointing the microphone directly at the bound man on the floor. I looked back down at the hitman. I told him he was going to make a phone call, and he was going to perform the most important acting job of his miserable life. I outlined a very specific, very brief script. I warned him that if his voice shook, if he tried to subtly warn her, or if he deviated from my exact words, our agreement was instantly void. The man nodded frantically, sweat beading on his forehead. I dialed the only contact saved inside the heavy burner phone. I pressed the speakerphone button and held the device up to his face. The line rang once. It rang twice. The tension in the dark kitchen was absolute. Then the ringing stopped. A sharp click echoed from the small speaker. Monica answered. Her voice was hushed, but the underlying tension was unmistakable. She demanded to know if there were any complications. She did not sound like a woman on a relaxing vacation. She sounded like an eager predator waiting for the kill to be confirmed. I pressed the cold barrel of the shotgun against his pale cheek. He took a sharp, ragged breath, steadying his vocal cords. He read from the mental script I had just violently etched into his mind. He told her it was done. He said the old man panicked exactly as she predicted. He told her I had dragged the boy into the heavy vehicle and sped out into the darkness. He paused for half a second, his eyes locked onto mine, and delivered the final, crushing lie. He told her the car had gone off the cliff and was currently sitting at the bottom of the lake. The response that echoed through the small speakerphone made the blood completely freeze in my veins. There was no hesitation. There was no sudden wave of maternal guilt or remorse for the horrific death of her only child. There was only a long, heavy exhale of profound relief. Her voice dripped with a sinister, pure joy that I will never forget for as long as I live. She said the word, perfect. She spoke the word with the satisfaction of a corporate executive closing a massive, lucrative merger. She then issued her final, chilling commands. She told him to scrub the driveway and make sure the police did not find the submerged bodies for at least a few days. She explained that she needed the timeline to remain ambiguous until they returned to port. Then, with a casualness that was truly horrifying, she confirmed her own financial treason. She told him the rest of the cryptocurrency transfer, The second half of his blood money would go out tomorrow morning. I reached out and ended the call. The screen of the burner phone went black. I looked down at my own smartphone resting on the marble island. The audio application was still running, capturing the heavy silence of the kitchen. I stopped the recording and saved the file to a secure encrypted cloud server. I backed it up to 3 different locations in an instant. I finally had them both completely trapped. I pocketed my smartphone, letting the weight of the digital evidence settle against my chest. The hitman remained frozen against the marble island, his chest heaving with terrified, shallow breaths. He knew his life now depended entirely on my next move. I did not offer him a single word of reassurance. I turned my back on him, walked into my private study, and locked the heavy oak door. I picked up my encrypted landline and dialed a number I had hoped I would never need to use in this capacity. Bradley Pierce was not just a corporate attorney. He was a ruthless, brilliant legal strategist who had spent the last 2 decades dismantling corrupt corporate empires and defending high-net-worth clients against federal indictments. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and alert despite the early morning hour. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him my son and daughter-in-law had just orchestrated a contracted hit against me and my grandson. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. I told Bradley I had the hired killer bound on my kitchen floor, physical evidence of the sabotaged vehicle, the poisoned tea, and a crystal-clear audio recording of Monica confirming the execution and the subsequent financial payout. Bradley's legal mind processed the information in a fraction of a second. He asked me what I needed him to do. I told him to call his highest-level contacts within the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically the Financial Crimes Unit, and the Organized Crime Task Force. I needed a secure tactical extraction, and I needed it immediately. Bradley promised he would have a federal team at my gates within the hour. I hung up the phone, walked over to the vintage globe sitting on my desk, and poured myself 3 fingers of neat bourbon. My hands were finally perfectly steady. The adrenaline of pure survival was slowly fading, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. I was no longer fighting for my life. I was engineering their absolute destruction. Exactly 42 minutes later, a fleet of unmarked black sport utility vehicles rolled silently up my long gravel driveway. Their headlights were extinguished, guided only by the ambient moonlight and tactical night vision. The heavy iron gates, which I had remotely unlocked, swung open to admit them. Armed federal agents moved with terrifying practiced efficiency. They poured out of the vehicles, establishing a secure perimeter around the estate before I even had the chance to unbolt the front door. I met the lead agent, a tall, imposing man named Special Agent Vance, in the grand foyer. I led him and his tactical team directly into the kitchen. The hitman let out a pathetic whimper of relief as the heavily armed agents surrounded him. He knew federal custody was infinitely safer than remaining alone in a dark house with me. They hauled him up, read him his rights, and marched him out to a waiting transport vehicle. Once the threat was removed, the house transformed into an active, meticulous crime scene. Forensic technicians in white protective suits began bagging and tagging the physical evidence. I walked Agent Vance through every single detail of the nightmare. I handed over the bone china teacup containing the heavily drugged chamomile tea, watching as a technician carefully sealed it inside a sterile evidence bag. I provided them with the original medical power of attorney documents and the life insurance policies I had extracted from my hidden floor safe. I surrendered the hitman's burner phone and transferred the digital audio files directly to the FBI's secure servers. They listened to the hitman's terrified confession. Then they listened to the chilling phone call. When Monica's voice echoed through the kitchen, confirming her joy over her own child's staged death, a heavy, disgusted silence fell over the veteran law enforcement officers. The final piece of the puzzle came from Leo. I retrieved him from the panic room, wrapping him in a heavy blanket. I removed his digital smartwatch and handed it to the cyber technicians. The hidden audio recordings Leo had captured weeks ago, detailing Preston and Monica's initial plotting and their desperate gambling debts, provided the undeniable premeditated motive. The case was flawless. It was a perfectly wrapped gift for a highly ambitious federal prosecutor. Agent Vance pulled me aside into the living room as the forensic teams finished processing the kitchen. He looked at me with a profound mixture of professional respect and deep personal sympathy. He outlined their immediate operational protocol. He explained that the luxury cruise ship was scheduled to dock at the Port of Victoria in British Columbia very shortly. The FBI intended to coordinate with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They planned to board the massive vessel the moment it dropped anchor, arrest Preston and Monica in their stateroom, and extradite them back across the northern border to face federal charges of conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and massive wire fraud. It was the standard-by-the-book procedure. They wanted to neutralize the targets as quickly and efficiently as possible. I stood by the large bay windows watching the red and blue emergency lights wash over my manicured lawn. I shook my head slowly. I turned back to Agent Vance and explicitly refused his plan. I spoke with a quiet, unyielding authority. I told him no. I told him that arresting them in Canada in the middle of their luxurious vacation was far too clean and far too abrupt. It would not give them the adequate opportunity to fully embrace the magnitude of their failure. I looked the seasoned federal agent directly in the eyes. I wanted them to think they had actually won. I wanted them to spend the next 5 days sitting on the deck of that ship, sipping expensive champagne, genuinely believing they had committed the perfect, untraceable crime. I wanted them to mentally spend the $7 million. I wanted them to step off that gangway and walk back onto United States soil, believing they were incredibly wealthy, completely untouchable, and finally free of me forever. I wanted them to experience the absolute pinnacle of their consuming greed right before I ripped the solid ground out from under their feet. I needed their reality to be completely shattered, not in a foreign port, but in the very city they thought they had conquered. Agent Vance stared at me for a long, silent moment. He saw the cold, unbreakable resolve radiating in my posture. He recognized that I was not acting out of blind emotional revenge, but out of a desperate need for absolute poetic justice. Slowly, a grim, acknowledging smile spread across his weathered face. He nodded his head in agreement. The FBI would not arrest them in Canada. They would let the ship sail. They would let Preston and Monica deeply enjoy their murderous vacation. We were going to set a masterful trap. A grand, spectacular sting operation waiting for them at the Seattle cruise terminal. They were going to walk right into a cage of their own making, completely blind to their impending doom. The heavy air in the kitchen shifted from the suffocating tension of a crime scene to the clinical efficiency of a highly coordinated federal operation. Agent Vance signaled his team, and 2 armored officers hoisted the hitman from the floor. The intruder, stripped of his bravado and absolutely terrified of federal charges, offered no resistance as they loaded him into an armored transport van. He was now a secured asset, the primary witness in a conspiracy that would bury my son and daughter-in-law under decades of federal prison time. Vance turned to me, explaining our immediate priority was extraction. The estate was no longer safe because the illusion of our deaths required absolute total absence. If a neighbor saw a light on or spotted movement through the windows, our fragile narrative would instantly collapse. I nodded and walked down the basement stairs, navigating the quiet corridors until I reached the panic room. I spun the dial and pulled the heavy vault open. Leo sat on the floor, the bright glow of the tablet illuminating his exhausted face. I knelt, wrapped my arms around him tightly, and lifted him into a protective embrace. I whispered that the bad men were finally gone, the police were helping us, and we were going on a secret trip. He clung to my neck as I carried him up the stairs and out into the night air. We bypassed the shattered doors and walked toward the federal vehicles. An agent ushered us into a tinted sport utility vehicle. The doors slammed shut, sealing us inside a quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary. We drove in silence, leaving the sprawling, shadowed grounds of the Mercer Island estate behind us in the dark. The convoy navigated the empty suburban streets, crossed the floating bridge, and merged onto the interstate, heading straight toward the towering skyline of downtown Seattle. The federal safe house was completely inconspicuous from the outside. It was located on the upper floors of a generic high-rise luxury apartment building in the heart of the financial district. There were no federal seals on the doors, no uniformed guards in the lobby, just a series of secure biometric checkpoints that led us to a spacious modern apartment with breathtaking panoramic views of the city. The space was pristine, sterile, and entirely off the grid. Agent Vance assigned a rotating detail of plainclothes agents to stand guard outside our reinforced door, ensuring that absolutely no one could trace our true location. We were ghosts waiting in the shadows while the trap was carefully baited. The next morning, the Federal Bureau of Investigation put the grand deception into motion. To sell the lie to Preston and Monica, who were undoubtedly monitoring the internet via their cruise ship's satellite connection, the authorities needed to provide public undeniable confirmation of our tragic demise. Agent Vance coordinated directly with the local Seattle Police Department and the Coast Guard to plant a controlled, highly specific narrative in the local news cycle. They did not need to fabricate a massive spectacle. They only needed to seed a vague, tragic story that matched Monica's exact expectations perfectly to avoid any suspicion. I sat on the plush sofa in the safe house living room, holding Leo close to my side, as Agent Vance turned on the large flat-screen television. We silently watched the local midday news broadcast. The anchor's face was solemn as she reported breaking news from Mercer Island. She detailed a horrific late-night accident involving a dark gray late-model sport utility vehicle. The reporter stated that the vehicle had inexplicably crashed through the heavy metal guardrails along the notoriously steep, winding roads overlooking Lake Washington. According to the fabricated police report, the heavy vehicle had plunged directly into the freezing, murky depths of the water. The anchor specifically noted that the vehicle matched the description of one registered to a prominent local resident, though names were being withheld pending notification of next of kin. The broadcast cut to a staged shot of police cruisers and Coast Guard boats illuminating the dark waters near the cliffs. The reporter somberly explained that search and rescue operations were severely hampered by the extreme depth of the lake and the hazardous underwater currents. No bodies had been recovered, and the authorities were treating it as a tragic, fatal accident. It was a masterpiece of controlled misinformation. The story provided every single detail Monica required. It confirmed the location, the vehicle, the timeline, and the convenient lack of immediate bodies which she had explicitly demanded from the hitman to delay any toxicology reports. I turned off the television, feeling a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. I knew exactly what was happening hundreds of miles away in the Pacific Ocean. Monica and Preston were sitting in their luxury suite, reading that exact news headline and clinking their champagne glasses in a toast to their newly inherited millions. They believed they had won. The following 5 days inside the federal safe house felt like an eternity suspended in time. Outside the soundproof windows, the bustling city of Seattle moved with a frantic, oblivious energy. Inside, the world was reduced to the quiet, gentle rhythm of healing. I spent every waking moment focused entirely on my grandson. The magnitude of the trauma he had endured over the past few months, living in a house governed by a mother who saw him as disposable collateral and a father who viewed him as a burden, was profound. Leo was a child who had learned to survive by making himself invisible, by swallowing his words and burying his emotions to avoid triggering Monica's calculated wrath. We sat together on the floor of the safe house building highly complex structures out of the architectural block, sets the federal agents had thoughtfully provided to keep his brilliant mind completely engaged and safely occupied. I did not push him to talk or recount the horrors. I simply stayed present, offering a steady, unwavering source of absolute safety. I held him when the silent tears fell, wrapping my arms around him and rocking him gently back and forth. I whispered promises into his hair, vows forged in the fires of the betrayal we had just survived. I told him that the terrible nightmare was finally over. I promised him that he would never have to return to that cold, dark, suffocating dynamic. I looked into his expressive, searching eyes and told him that he was brilliant, that his life possessed immeasurable value, and that he would never have to hide his voice again. I explained that true monsters do not lurk in the shadows or hide beneath beds. Sometimes they wear the familiar masks of family smiling while they scheme. But I assured him that those specific monsters had been defeated. They had underestimated our strength, and they were sailing blindly toward a concrete wall of justice. Leo rested his head against my chest, his small fingers gripping my shirt. The trembling that had plagued his fragile frame for months finally began to subside. We were safe, we were together, and we were patiently waiting for the ship to return to port. 5 days passed with an agonizing slowness, but the inevitable morning finally broke across the Seattle skyline. The thick fog burned away, revealing the brilliant white hull of the luxury cruise liner as it glided into the terminal at Pier 91. I sat in the cramped interior of an armored federal surveillance van, parked discreetly on a raised access road overlooking the passenger disembarkation zone. Agent Vance sat beside me, his eyes locked onto a bank of high-definition monitors, displaying live video feeds from different angles. We watched the trap slowly close its steel jaws tightly. The terminal was a chaotic sea of activity. Thousands of exhausted vacationers dragged luggage down the gangways, eager to return home. Interspersed seamlessly within that crowd were nearly 24 highly trained federal agents dressed in casual civilian clothing. They blended in perfectly, wearing bright Hawaiian shirts, carrying oversized tote bags, and holding digital cameras. Their sole operational directive was to monitor every single movement my son and my daughter-in-law made from the exact second their feet touched United States soil. I watched the primary monitor intently. Preston and Monica strolled down the main gangway looking the picture of relaxed entitlement. Preston wore crisp linen trousers and a navy blazer. Monica walked beside him, her face shielded by massive dark sunglasses. They were actually laughing together, sharing a private joke as they navigated the ramp. It was the carefree laughter of two sociopaths who fully believed their murderous gamble had paid off in spectacular fashion. They believed they were walking back into a city where I was dead, where my grandson Leo was dead, and where a mountain of cash was waiting for them in offshore accounts. They reached the bottom of the ramp and cleared the initial customs checkpoint without incident. They stepped out onto the main passenger concourse, heading toward the designated pickup zone. Agent Vance tapped a button on his communication console, issuing a quiet, definitive order to the ground team. The sting operation officially commenced. A uniformed Seattle police officer, a veteran detective specifically chosen by the federal task force for his ability to maintain absolute composure, stepped out from the bustling crowd and blocked their path. The audio feed piped directly into our surveillance van, crisp and clear. The officer removed his hat, his face a perfectly constructed mask of professional sorrow. He asked to confirm their identities. Preston, looking mildly annoyed by the sudden interruption, confirmed who they were with a haughty, dismissive tone. The detective then took a slow, calculated breath and delivered the fabricated tragic news exactly as the FBI had scripted it. He told them there had been a catastrophic accident involving my vehicle. He told them I had apparently suffered a severe medical emergency, driven off the steep cliffs of Mercer Island, and plunged directly into the freezing depths of Lake Washington, with their only young son securely trapped deep inside the dark, submerged car. The performance that followed was nothing short of an absolute masterclass in psychotic deception. It was an Oscar-worthy display of fabricated agony that made my blood run entirely cold. Monica did not simply gasp or cover her mouth in shock. She let out a piercing, blood-curdling scream that echoed across the concrete pier. It was a high-pitched theatrical shriek designed to instantly draw the attention of every single passenger dock worker and security guard within 100 yards. She threw her hands into the air and collapsed violently to her knees on the hard pavement. She began to sob hysterically, burying her face against her designer handbag, wailing her son's name over and over again with a manufactured desperation that was truly, utterly, profoundly sickening to witness from my distant vantage point. Preston immediately followed her cue. He staggered backward, his face twisting into a grotesque mask of shock and unbearable grief. He dropped their expensive leather suitcases, letting them crash onto the ground. He buried his face heavily in his hands, his shoulders heaving with massive simulated sobs. He fell to his knees beside his wife, wrapping his arms around her shaking frame, performing the role of the devastated, broken father for the growing crowd of horrified onlookers and the surrounding security cameras. They were playing to the audience, ensuring there were hundreds of independent witnesses who could later testify to their profound, complete devastation. Agent Vance crossed his arms over his chest, his expression hardening as he watched the monitor. He had spent 2 decades hunting the worst elements of human nature, but the sheer, unadulterated sociopathy displayed by my son and his wife left a visible look of disgust on his face. I simply stared at the screen, my heart completely devoid of any remaining paternal affection. The people sobbing on that pier were not family. They were just monstrous predators. The uniformed detective gently helped them to their feet, offering quiet words of manufactured comfort. He escorted them away from the crowded pier and guided them into a waiting, unmarked police cruiser. They were transported directly to the Port Authority administrative offices under the guise of providing them with a quiet, secure environment to process the horrific news. The surveillance feed switched to the hidden cameras previously installed inside the small gray administrative conference room. This was the moment their absolute greed finally eclipsed their fabricated grief. The transition was incredibly jarring. The moment the heavy office door clicked shut, isolating them from the public eye, the hysterical sobbing instantly ceased. The profound, paralyzing devastation vanished entirely. Monica sat down in a rigid plastic chair, casually wiped a stray fake tear from her cheek, and pulled a compact mirror from her purse to quickly check her makeup. Preston paced the small room, rubbing his hands together with a nervous energy that had nothing to do with actual mourning at all. They did not ask the detective a single question about the final moments of their child. They did not ask about the ongoing search and rescue operations, the water temperature, or the exact location of the vehicle. They did not even ask to go to the morgue or the scene of the accident to see the bodies. The concept of actual grief was completely foreign to them. Within 2 hours of stepping off that luxury cruise ship, they pivoted entirely to the execution of their financial windfall. Preston turned to the detective, adopting a cold tone of forced, calculated pragmatism. He stated that while they were utterly devastated, they needed to handle the tragic legalities immediately. Monica nodded in agreement, her voice perfectly steady. She looked directly at the detective and impatiently demanded that the police expedite the issuance of the death certificates. She stated with chilling calmness that they desperately needed those specific legal documents by the end of the business day so they could contact the life insurance conglomerates to arrange the proper funerals. The sheer audacity of their request echoed loudly through the speakers of the surveillance van. They were literally demanding the massive financial payout before the sun had even set on their fabricated tragedy. The trap was now fully entirely sprung and completely locked shut. Agent Vance gave a sharp nod from his seat inside the surveillance van, signaling the undercover operative stationed inside the Port Authority office to proceed. The man sitting across the gray laminate table from Preston and Monica was not a simple administrative clerk or a local grieving counselor. He was a veteran federal agent trained specifically in financial crimes and corporate fraud, posing as an expedited claims liaison. He wore a slightly rumpled suit and maintained an aura of bureaucratic sympathy, playing his role with absolute perfection. He slid a thick stack of official, professional-looking documents across the table. He explained in a soft, apologetic tone that given the high-profile nature of the tragic accident, the staggering value of the estate, and the intense media scrutiny surrounding the submerged vehicle, the insurance conglomerates required immediate, sworn signatures to authorize the release of the accidental death benefits and to formally activate the secondary clauses of the medical power of attorney. Monica stared at the documents, her eyes gleaming with an unmistakable predatory hunger. The tears she had manufactured on the pier just hours ago were completely gone. Her posture was rigid, leaning forward over the table like a starving animal inspecting a fresh kill. She nudged Preston sharply in the ribs, a silent, impatient command to secure their prize. Preston picked up the heavy black pen the agent had provided. His hands were shaking violently. I watched the live video feed from the monitor in the van, analyzing the tremor in his fingers. He was not shaking from the unbearable sorrow of losing his only child. He was not trembling from the traumatic shock of losing his father. He was vibrating with the raw, unadulterated adrenaline of impending wealth. The prospect of $7 million in untraceable cash was surging through his veins, completely overriding any remaining shred of human decency or moral hesitation. Preston pressed the tip of the pen against the crisp white paper. He did not bother to read the fine print. He did not ask for a moment of silence or request time to mourn before handling financial matters. He simply began to sign his name. The scratching sound of the pen against the paper echoed through the hidden audio feed, loud and rhythmic. With every stroke of ink, Preston and Monica were not just claiming a fraudulent insurance payout. They were actively, undeniably committing massive federal wire fraud, insurance fraud, and cementing their roles in a conspiracy to commit premeditated murder. They were meticulously locking the doors to their own prison cells from the inside. Monica leaned over his shoulder, her breath catching in her throat, as she watched the final page receive his signature. She reached out and placed her manicured hand over his, giving it a firm, triumphant squeeze. They had done it. In their twisted sociopathic minds, they had successfully executed the perfect crime. They had eliminated their financial burdens, erased the familial obstacles standing in their way, and secured a life of absolute, unhindered luxury. Preston set the pen down on the table with a heavy, satisfying click. He pushed the stack of signed documents back toward the undercover agent, letting out a long, ragged exhale of profound relief. He actually managed to conjure a weak, sorrowful smile, attempting to play the role of the brave, grieving father one last time. The undercover agent slowly pulled the documents across the table. He neatly aligned the edges of the paper, tapping them gently against the laminate surface. He did not offer a sympathetic smile in return. He simply looked up at Preston, his expression shifting from bureaucratic warmth to a mask of cold, unyielding stone. He reached beneath the edge of the conference table and pressed a hidden tactical button. The precise second the agent's finger engaged the signal, the heavy reinforced oak doors of the administrative conference room swung violently open. The loud, sudden crash of the doors hitting the drywall echoed through the small space like a thunderclap. The entire room instantly plunged into a state of absolute dead silence. The simulated sorrow vanished from Preston's face, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, uncomprehending shock. Monica gasped, her hands flying to her throat, as she spun around in her chair to face the open doorway. The air in the room grew heavy and suffocating, thick with the sudden crushing weight of undeniable reality. I stepped slowly through the doorway, crossing the threshold, with the calm, measured stride of a man who had engineered this exact moment for 5 agonizing days. The bright fluorescent lights of the administrative office cast harsh, unforgiving shadows across my face. I was not lying dead at the bottom of a freezing lake. I was not a crushed, broken body trapped inside a mangled vehicle. I was perfectly alive, perfectly unharmed, and radiating a cold, terrifying fury that instantly filled every corner of the room. But I did not walk into that room alone. My right hand was firmly, securely wrapped around the small, warm hand of my grandson. Leo stepped through the doorway right beside me. He was wearing a bright blue sweater, his dark hair neatly combed, his dark eyes wide and alert. He stood tall, his posture completely devoid of the cowering fear that had defined his existence under Monica's tyrannical rule. He looked directly at the 2 monsters sitting across the table. He did not flinch. He did not hide behind my leg. He stood his ground, radiating the quiet, unbreakable strength of a survivor who had finally realized he was no longer the prey. The silence stretched out, fragile and absolute. Preston's jaw dropped open. His eyes bulged wide, staring at me and his son, as if we were terrifying apparitions, summoned directly from the depths of hell. He tried to speak to form a coherent word, but his vocal cords completely failed him. Only a pathetic, strangled wheeze escaped his pale lips. He looked from the signed insurance documents resting on the table to my living, breathing face, his mind desperately trying and failing to reconcile the impossible contradiction. Monica's reaction was visceral. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her skin a sickly, pallid gray. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble uncontrollably, knocking her designer handbag onto the linoleum floor. She shrank back into the rigid plastic chair, her eyes darting frantically toward the open doorway, searching for an escape route that absolutely did not exist. The brilliant, foolproof narrative she had constructed, the murderous masterpiece she had paid $50,000 to orchestrate, was disintegrating into dust before her very eyes. I stood at the head of the long table, my grip tightening around Leo's small hand. I did not yell. I did not scream or curse. I simply looked down at my son, staring past the expensive linen suit and the carefully crafted facade, staring into the cowardly, rotten core of the man I had raised. I let the crushing, inescapable weight of his catastrophic failure settle onto his shoulders. The magnificent illusion they had built was over. The ghost had returned, bringing the wrath of absolute justice right to their front door. The heavy black pen slipped from Preston's trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the laminate surface of the conference table before rolling off the edge and striking the cold linoleum floor. It was the only sound in the suffocating vacuum of the room. He stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, his jaw working uselessly, as if trying to form words his paralyzed brain could no longer process. He looked from me to Leo and then back to me, trapped in a nightmare where the dead returned to collect their debts. Monica immediately reacted with a visceral, violent, and suffocating terror. The last remaining drops of color instantly drained from her face, leaving her complexion a sickly, ashen gray. She stumbled backward until her shoulders slammed hard against a tall metal filing cabinet. The impact rattled the drawers, but she barely registered the pain. She was gasping for air, taking shallow, ragged breaths as her hands clawed desperately at the collar of her silk blouse. The grand illusion of their impending wealth shattered into jagged pieces around them. They expected to claim a $7 million fortune, convinced they were architects of a flawless tragedy. Instead, they found themselves locked in a small room with the man they paid $50,000 to assassinate. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream, curse, or lunge across the table. I possessed a profound, icy calm born from 5 agonizing days of meticulous preparation. I walked slowly and deliberately toward the center of the room, my footsteps steady, keeping Leo safely tucked by my side. The undercover federal agent stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on the targets, ready to act on my signal. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and retrieved my smartphone. I held it up for a brief moment, letting the sleek device catch the harsh fluorescent light overhead. Preston and Monica watched the phone with a morbid, terrified fascination. They knew instinctively that whatever I held in my hand was the fatal nail in their coffin. I placed the phone gently in the very center of the conference table, right on top of the life insurance documents Preston had just eagerly signed. I tapped the screen once, unlocked the interface, and pressed play on the audio file. The room was instantly filled with the terrified, stammering voice of the hitman they had hired. He recited his confession detailing the underground lending syndicate, the $50,000 cash payment, and the mechanical sabotage of my vehicle. Preston's knees finally buckled. He collapsed back into his plastic chair, his face buried in his hands, crying tears of absolute self-serving terror. Then, the hitman's voice was replaced by the ringing of a phone line. Monica flinched as if she had been struck. Her own voice echoed through the small office, crisp, clear, and undeniably authentic. The federal agents stationed in the room listened in stony silence as the recorded version of Monica eagerly asked if the job was done, if there were complications, and if the bodies were safely at the bottom of the lake. When the hitman confirmed our violent deaths, the recording captured Monica's profound exhale of relief. It played the exact moment she called the murder of her only child perfect. I watched Monica slide slowly down the front of the metal filing cabinet, her legs giving out, until she sat on the floor in a trembling heap. The audio file ended, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The sheer depravity of the recording, played back in the presence of the child she had intended to kill, stripped away the final remnants of her humanity. She was exposed in her monstrosity, surrounded by federal agents, who now looked at her with unvarnished disgust. I looked down at Leo. He had stood silently by my side through the entire agonizing playback. He had listened to his mother orchestrate his death, yet his small hand remained perfectly steady in my grip. The immense psychological burden he had carried for months, the terrifying secret of his parents' true nature, no longer weighed him down. He was no longer the frightened boy hiding in the shadows of his own home. He slowly pulled his hand free from mine. He took one deliberate step forward, moving away from my protective shadow and standing directly in front of the conference table. He looked down at his mother, who was still huddled against the filing cabinet on the floor. Monica slowly raised her head, meeting her son's gaze with eyes wide with terror. For months, she had treated him as a mute prop, an inconvenient object to be managed and discarded. She had severely underestimated the observant mind locked inside that silent exterior. Leo took a deep breath, his small chest expanding. The boy who was deemed entirely mute, the child who had refused to speak a single word out of sheer paralyzing fear, finally found his voice. He spoke clearly, loudly, and with an unwavering authority that cut straight through the tension in the room. He looked directly into the eyes of the woman who birthed him. He said, "The tea tasted bitter, Mom, so I told Grandpa not to drink it." Those simple words, spoken with the innocent clarity of a child, destroyed her completely. Monica let out a pathetic, suffocated gasp, burying her face in her hands as the finality of her failure crashed down. She had meticulously calculated the chemical dosage, the timing, and my protective instincts, but she failed to account for the profound love between a grandfather and his grandson. The seasoned undercover agent positioned behind the table did not wait for another second. He gave a sharp, tactical nod to the agents positioned near the doorway. The trap snapped entirely shut. The federal agents moved with sudden, explosive velocity. They crossed the room in a fraction of a second. Two large agents grabbed Preston by the shoulders, hauling him violently out of his chair and slamming him face first against the drywall. He let out a sharp, pathetic cry of pain, but offered zero resistance as the heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists. On the far other side of the room, agents hauled Monica up from the floor. She shrieked, kicking and flailing in a burst of panicked resistance. But the seasoned officers pinned her against the metal filing cabinet, securing her arms firmly behind her back. The lead agent's voice boomed over the chaos, reciting their Miranda rights and listing the staggering array of federal charges. They were officially under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, massive wire, and insurance fraud, and the attempted murder of a minor. I reached out and gently pulled Leo back to my side, shielding him from the violent reality of his parents' arrest. I picked up my phone from the table, sliding it back into my pocket, alongside the fraudulent insurance claims they had just signed. Preston and Monica were marched out of the room, their heads forced down, wrists bound in steel. The grand illusion was over, and the rest of their miserable lives would be spent in a concrete cell. The wheels of federal justice grind exceedingly slow, but in the specific case of Preston and Monica, they ground with a brutal, unforgiving finality that left absolutely no room for interpretation. There was absolutely no mercy granted in that grand federal courtroom, no lenient plea deals offered by the highly ambitious prosecutor, and no sympathetic jury swayed by their pathetic, desperate fake tears. The sheer volume of undeniable digital and physical evidence, perfectly coupled with the horrific, sickening nature of their premeditated plot against their very own flesh and blood, thoroughly disgusted the presiding judge to his absolute core. They were both handed consecutive, devastating sentences amounting to exactly 25 years in a maximum security federal prison without the slightest possibility of early parole. During the final emotionally charged sentencing hearing, the court took the highly unusual but entirely necessary step of permanently revoking their parental rights, officially terminating any legal, biological, or emotional claim they ever held over my innocent grandson. I was immediately granted full, permanent, and irrevocable custody of Leo. He was legally mine to love and fiercely protect, and his biological parents were legally erased from his bright, promising future forever. But my pursuit of absolute poetic justice did not stop at simply putting those two monsters behind reinforced steel bars for the remainder of their adult lives. I utilized every aggressive, tactical, legal avenue available through Bradley Pierce to systematically and completely dismantle Preston's entire remaining estate piece by piece. We filed massive, crippling civil suits that effectively seized the sprawling Mercer Island house, the hidden offshore bank accounts, and every single luxury vehicle attached to their names. I sold the massive waterfront property at a significant premium, completely liquidated every single physical asset they ever owned, and placed every remaining cent into an ironclad, impenetrable trust fund designed exclusively for Leo's future education and well-being. Preston and Monica were left with absolutely nothing but the scratchy orange jumpsuits on their backs and the cold, terrifying reality of their massive, catastrophic failures. And as for Preston's staggering $4 million gambling debt, the ruthless underground lending syndicate operating out of the commercial shipping ports did not suddenly forgive that astronomical sum just because he was permanently incarcerated behind massive concrete walls. Word travels incredibly fast in those dark, violent underground circles. The dangerous, unforgiving men he owed that massive amount of money to knew exactly which specific prison block he was currently housed in, and those criminal organizations always possess a very long, incredibly punitive reach that walls cannot stop. I left the corrupting, suffocating influence of the city behind shortly after the trial officially concluded. I bought a small, beautiful, incredibly peaceful house on a quiet plot of land, deep in the lush green Pacific Northwest, entirely far away from the toxic ambition, the suffocating greed, and the hollow superficiality of their former lives. Today, I sit comfortably on my wide wooden porch, feeling the gentle, cool morning breeze against my face, and listening to a sound that completely heals my battered, tired soul. Leo sits closely beside me, holding a thick, adventurous book in his small hands, confidently reading the chapters aloud with perfect pronunciation. He no longer hides his brilliant mind, suppresses his complex emotions, or fears the sound of his own thoughts. He freely smiles now, eager to carefully share his bright imagination with anyone who is lucky enough to truly listen. The severe, paralyzing trauma of his dark past is slowly but surely fading away, rapidly, replaced by a radiant, confident joy that warms my heart entirely. His beautiful voice, once stolen by a cruel, calculating mother and an indifferent, greedy father, is now loud, expressive, and vibrantly full of incredible life. Listening to him read those pages, listening to the natural, unburdened cadence of his breathing, is the absolute greatest treasure I have left in this world. The most dangerous predators in our lives rarely break through the windows. They usually have keys to the front door. Blood does not automatically equal loyalty, and turning a blind eye to glaring red flags out of pure parental love will only arm the people trying to destroy you. True protection means having the courage to see your loved ones for who they actually are, not who you desperately wish them to be. Never let unconditional love become a blindfold, and never underestimate the silent observers in the room. Silence is not ignorance. Sometimes it is the ultimate survival tool. If this story opened your eyes today, please hit the like button and quickly subscribe to the channel. Have you ever discovered a shocking betrayal from someone you totally trusted? Share your story in the comments below, let me know where you are watching from, and stay tuned for more.